The concept of ecocide was first bandied about in 1970 in the context of the US chemical warfare in Vietnam. Eco as in ecosystem, and side as in killing or the act of killing, like genocide, but referring to the environment, ecocide. As Tim mentioned, I spent last week in The Hague with the International Criminal Court Bar Association Ecocide Working Group, which I chair, where we worked on answering some of those questions, although, of course, as is often the case when you gather a bunch of lawyers from different legal systems from around the world, left us with more questions. In the last few years, the push to make ecocide an international crime has gathered momentum. The international community, via international judicial bodies, has shown a global interest in environmental issues. For example, Australia petitioned the International Court of Justice in the whaling case against Japan in 2010, where it claimed that Japan was in breach of obligations under the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling, as well as other international obligations. Some of you who are in this room or online may have worked on that case, which is incredibly impressive. There's also the pulp mills case, for example, from 2006, where Argentina instituted proceedings before the International Court of Justice against Uruguay concerning 2 pulp mills which threatened the River Uruguay and its environment. And more recently, the European Court of Human Rights found that the Swiss Federation had failed to comply with duties or positive obligations under the European Convention of Human Rights concerning climate change. That is, the Swiss were considered not to be taking sufficient action to mitigate climate change. What these cases demonstrate is that an appetite exists to use international law to bring justice for environmental issues, which brings us to ecocide. There were vigorous discussions on foot in The Hague last week about ecocide and its inclusion as a crime in the Rome Statute, which is the treaty that underpins the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, not to be confused with the Cricket Council. Before I launch into the crime of ecocide and its proposed legal definition, it might be useful to provide some background into what the ICC does. And Tim's already touched on it, but it's the foundation is probably an easy place to start. So the ICC was established in Rome in 1998 when the wording of the Rome Statute was finally agreed upon by the international community. Professor Tim McCormick played an integral role in that process and was in Rome in the lead up to its adoption. So we have in our presence international criminal law royalty. The ICC is the first permanent international criminal court which has jurisdiction over those 4 types of crime that Tim just mentioned: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. Aggression wasn't originally inserted into the Rome Statute. It was amended later and added in 2010, which is important for our purposes regarding ecocide. The ICC has jurisdiction over individuals rather than governments, organisations, or corporations. That is, individual criminal responsibility over persons. So that's different from the International Court of Justice, for example, where states bring actions against other states, not individuals. The International Court of Justice is not a criminal court, but rather it's more akin to civil litigation. The International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice are often confused, and it doesn't make it easier that they're both in The Hague. But we will focus today on the International Criminal Court. The Rome Statute has been ratified by 124 states, with Australia being one of those. We were one of the founding ones. There are key world players who aren't party to the Rome Statute, like the US, China, and Russia. Mind you, the US is a very active observer of the ICC, and for a non-member state seems to have a lot of influence, but I digress, and that's a conversation for another day. The ICC has jurisdictions over persons who are nationals of member states and over persons who commit crimes on the territory of member states. So for example, Ukraine has accepted the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, which means the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over Russian nationals who commit crimes in the territory of Ukraine, like, for example, Vladimir Putin. The ICC can also have jurisdiction over territories or persons of a state which have been referred for investigation by the UN Security Council. So as I mentioned before, key players of the Security Council, the US, China and Russia, are not member states of the ICC. So far, only Darfur and Libya have been referred by the ICC for investigation by the Security Council, with glaring absences like Syria not being referred. The ICC will only step in and prosecute crimes within its jurisdiction if they are not being prosecuted at a national level. That is, it's a court of last resort. This is also referred to as the principle of complementarity. So ecocide has been proposed by various international groups and states, member states, such as our neighbour Vanuatu, to be included as a fifth crime in the Rome Statute. And that's what I was in The Hague to talk about. In my view, and this is my personal view, not reflecting the view of the Ecocide Working Group, although we're fairly like-minded, ecocide will eventually make itself into the Rome Statute as a fifth crime. Pressure from the international community will ensure that will happen. It's just a matter of time. When you consider the ICC's mandate, it's a global court dealing with the greatest threats to humanity. Future generations will not accept that an international court that does not include a crime of environmental destruction in peacetime can exist. That would go its very intention, and that is very important. But before that can happen, the member states of the ICC, by 2/3 majority, will need to agree on a definition for inclusion in the Rome Statute. And it's important that is done properly and that the international community gets it right. So there are several steps to get there. Firstly, we need a definition. The next step is that a member state or a group of member states officially introduces the crime of ecocide as a proposed amendment to the Rome Statute, as it did for aggression. Once it is introduced and then on the table, it is debated by the member states, and that's a lengthy process that can take years. When an agreed text of the amended text is finalised, it's introduced to the Assembly of State Parties, which meets once a year, and voted on. And if that 2/3 majority is achieved, it will be ratified, and it's only then it becomes an enforceable crime before the ICC. Sounds so simple. So where are we at in that process? At the very beginning. But it's a process, as we said, is gaining momentum and finding traction. And it's a process that needs to progress despite the amount of work that lies ahead. I quote my friend, Professor Rebecca Hamilton, a former colleague of mine at the International Criminal Court. She's the current Fulbright Scholar at the University of Malta and Professor of International Law at the American University in Washington, DC. She says that the potential for the crime of ecocide to send a clear, expressive message about the relationship humans have with our environment could nonetheless make the effort worthwhile. To say that humans are inseparable from the natural world is obvious, and it is something that most people need to be reminded of. And that's from her upcoming article on criminalising ecocide, which I'll distribute once it's made public. At this juncture, several definitions for the crime of ecocide have been put forward, but the predominant one comes from the Stop Ecocide Now Foundation, which convened a panel of experts of international legal powerhouses, including Philip Sands, Kate McIntosh and Alex Whiting. In June 2021, this was the definition they proposed. Ecocide means the unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So we'll break that down. 1, an unlawful or wanton or reckless act. 2, which needs to be committed with the knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of a consequence. Substantial likelihood being more than a possibility, but less than a standard of more likely. And the third step is that consequence needs to be either widespread or long-term damage to the environment. You can probably understand how science will play a role, particularly in the consequence portion of that crime. So this is the definition that's now being discussed. It hasn't been officially been introduced, but to the states or put on the table, but I'm hoping that will happen sooner rather than later. The next Assembly of State Parties is at the end of this year. I won't deny that generally there's a pessimism around whether ICC is equipped to investigate and prosecute ecocide as a fifth crime, and I certainly heard a lot about that when I was in The Hague last week. It's struggling to investigate and prosecute the crimes it is currently mandated with, and there are difficulties bringing suspects to the court. There's been one arrest in the last 3.5 years, and although that person was released and charges withdrawn, there's no one left awaiting trial, and there's 16 suspects with outstanding arrest warrants who remain at large. I heard arguments last week against the inclusion of the fifth crime, of ecocide, because there was already a war crime under Article 8, subsection 2b, Roman numeral 4 of the Rome Statute, which criminalises intentional attacks in the knowledge that such attacks will cause widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment, which would be clearly in excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated. So that's in the context of war. And in my view, acts which would constitute the crime of ecocide happen outside in the context of war, even more so than they do inside the context of war. For example, destruction of Amazonian rainforests are not happening in the context of war. Reckless oil spills are not happening in the context of war. Another example, the Total Energies East Africa crude oil pipeline is currently under construction and will run through from the shores of beautiful Lake Albert in Uganda through to Tanzania. It's predicted that it will disturb 2,000 square kilometres of protected wildlife habitats, including Murchison Falls National Park, Tala Forest Reserve and Bugoma Forest. I was in Uganda only last year and saw with my own eyes the devastating effects already. Traditional agricultural farming communities are dependent on land to survive, and the effects are there already. They are communities which don't have a backup plan. There's no social security or support if the crops no longer grow. Widespread or long-term damage to the environment. The pipeline will run through Lake Victoria, which services more than 40 million people with water and food production. Imagine an oil spill or a leak. The consequences would be catastrophic. Wanton or reckless? Ecocide? To date, I don't know of any charges of environmental crimes against any suspect before the ICC. I think that could have already been done. That's my view. Former President Omar al-Bashir of the Sudan ordered a scorched earth campaign to be carried out by Sudanese forces and Janjaweed in Darfur from 2003 to 2005, which resulted in an estimated 200,000 deaths and displacement of up to 2 million civilians. Janjaweed razed villages and crops and contaminated water supplies and food sources. I was working at the ICC in 2009 when an arrest warrant was issued against al-Bashir and others in his cabinet for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and then later genocide. The Scorched Earth campaign was used as evidence to underpin the genocide charge, but environmental crimes were not charged as war crimes. Perhaps they should have been. Al-Bashir is still at large, although he's no longer the president. Perhaps we'll see Article 8.2b, Roman numeral 4, charged in arrest warrants in Gaza if they don't eventuate, although I'm probably overreaching there. Or the bombing of the Kharkov Dam in Ukraine could also be a war crime, environmental war crime. The prosecutor of the ICC recently announced that his office will be drafting a policy paper on environmental crimes, and I quote from his press release, aiming to ensure that it takes a systematic approach to dealing with crimes within the court's jurisdiction committed by means of or that result in environmental damage. The ICC Bar Association Ecocide Working Group will certainly be providing comments on that draft policy, and I hope it's not merely a tick box or a distraction from the discourse around ecocide as a fifth crime in the Rome Statute. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for the push to charge war crimes and environmental crimes as war crimes. That's really, really important, but it's not enough. So where to from here? We press on with discussions and garnering support from the 124 member states of the ICC, or at least 2/3 of them, to include ecocide as a fifth crime in the Rome Statute. Work will need to be done on the elements of the crimes, the crime of ecocide, and how they will look, how they're defined, how they will interact with other parts of the Rome Statute, including modes of liability. There will be novel issues to consider. For example, the ICC has a unique system of where victims are represented throughout the pre-trial, trial and appeals process in a case. Counsel for victims are present in court and can question witnesses, make submissions, play an active role in providing a voice to victims in the courtroom throughout the proceedings. Victims are also entitled to reparations out of a trust fund for victims once an accused person has had all appeal rights exhausted and has been convicted of a crime. So recently, the court ordered more than €52 million to be paid to over 49,000 victims in northern Uganda after Lord Resistance Army Commander Dominic Ongwen was convicted and lost his appeal for war crimes and crimes against humanity in northern Uganda. So that was a really important case. But for ecocide cases, who will be considered the victim? Who is the victim for the purposes of reparations? Is the environment, or is it the human that lives in the environment? Can the two be separated? It opens up that whole anthropocentric versus ecocentric argument, and I don't have the answers here, and it's certainly a much bigger discussion than the one we can have here today, but it's one that is being had now and will continue to be had. There'll need to be amendments to the rules of procedure and evidence. I imagine the types of evidence that will be relied on, particularly for the consequence portion of the crime, may be novel by comparison to the evidence that's relied on for war crimes that aren't environmental crimes. And it's evidence that international criminal law prosecutors and counsel will be looking at to the science community for guidance. We will be relying heavily on people like those in this room and online to provide expertise and knowledge in that regard. I think it's important to get that community involved even at this early stage in providing advice on what we will be needing to prosecute these crimes or defend them. Of course, if a member state doesn't ratify the crime of ecocide, it doesn't have to be introduced into domestic legislation, but otherwise, it does. So in my view, the biggest hurdle will be to convince member states that ecocide should be included in the Rome Statute. If it is, there's certain obligation that those member states would carry, like including the crime of ecocide in domestic legislation, in implementing legislation. I can think of a number of countries who would oppose having ecocide as a crime in their own domestic legislation, and I wonder what Australia's position would be. It will be pressure from the international community which will get the crime of ecocide over the line as a fifth Rome Statute, and that pressure is mounting. We only need to look what's happening domestically to see the acceptance of ecocide as a crime. For example, Belgium has recently introduced ecocide as a crime for which individuals can be prosecuted, and the Netherlands, Mexico, Italy, Brazil and Spain have all introduced bills which criminalise ecocide. The European Council a couple of months ago recently formally adopted a new environmental crime directive, which includes provisions to criminalise cases comparable to ecocide. Mind you, Belgium's definition of ecocide is different to the proposed text in the expert panel definition, which may be a trend we see more as domestic legislation is enacted. It's a much narrower definition, and I'm not sure that it's quite right. So they say that the crime of ecocide is deliberately committing by act or omission an unlawful action causing serious widespread and long-term damage to the environment in the knowledge that this act causes such damage, provided that this acts constitute an infringement of federal legislation or an international instrument that is binding on the federal authority, or if the act cannot be located in Belgium. I know that's a really long explanation, but basically my point with that is it only includes the word unlawful acts, which under either Belgian or federal law, but it doesn't include the wanton and reckless act. So that means that the conduct does not significantly expand on the scope of conduct already unlawful under Belgian law. In my view, that narrower definition of ecocide is an ideal. For example, if a person is acting within the law, for example, logging trees in a manner that isn't against domestic law, then the first element of ecocide falls away, even if that logging causes serious, widespread and long-term damage to the environment. Not that Belgium's likely to have the old growth forests that we have, but that definition in Tasmania, for example, it would mean that our legislation would need to show that the act of logging is unlawful, or that methods of salmon farming, for example, in the beautiful Doncaster Channel would have to be unlawful for any ensuing environmental damage to fall into ecocide. Tricky. I wouldn't advocate for that definition to be in Australia. But having said that, or at least it is a step in the right direction. But perhaps if there was a definition adopted locally, a definition that narrow wouldn't catch the reckless acts. So while we work towards introducing the crime of ecocide into the Rome Statute, it will be important to see how prosecutions play out domestically. And the rising number of states are taking matters into their own hands by introducing ecocide as a crime domestically. Perhaps with the right pressure, Australia will be one of them with the right definition. Thank you. And I think we're opening it up to questions.
Yeah, let's have some questions.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Reggie.
No worries.
Thanks for a terrific overview of some of the issues. And I'm sure there'll be questions from the floor. If there aren't, I'm going to get into it with you.
Yeah, you do.
As in ask questions, but well, let's give them. Let's give the audience either online or face to face the opportunity to kick that off. Yes, over here. But should I get the microphone for the recording? That'd be a good idea.
Yeah, I can be a microphone. Probably just say who you are as well before you ask a question.
Thank you. Great talk. My name's Emma. I'm with CMS. Your talk made me think about fossil fuel companies having the knowledge that their product was causing climate change or would cause climate change in the future, and having plans to sort of adapt their future operations under that future scenario. Would there be any opportunity in any of the national or international versions of ecocide to prosecute that, perhaps in the same way that cigarettes companies were prosecuted?
Yeah, I mean, again, we have to go back to the fact it's individual criminal responsibility. So who was the person calling those shots recklessly? So it could be the head of an organisation who has taken advice and decided to discard that advice and still, made orders to go ahead with certain conduct. But people can be, under the International Criminal Court or under the Rome Statute, you can be held accountable either individually or as part of a group, but still individual criminal responsibility with that group, or as aiding and abetting. In military cases, it's command responsibility, but I'm not sure how that would apply in these cases. But there are options around that. So it would be a specific way of having to find the evidence to make that person accountable. For example, in traditional war crimes prosecutions, we found great value. We always had no trouble getting crime-based witnesses, which were the people whose lives, who were raped or saw their families murdered. That was always really easy to get. But to link the perpetrator, because the people that are prosecuted at the ICC are those most responsible for the most serious crimes. So not your foot soldiers, it's the people calling those shots. So the evidence that you would get against those sort of people are your insiders. So people who work closely with those people calling the shots. So it would absolutely be possible if that evidence existed. Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. Anyone else?
Emma.
Jack's next.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Reggie. Really appreciate the talk today. A really interesting discussion. Thank you. My name is Jack. I'm very privileged to be a student at the law school. My question, Reggie, is around the journey of ecocide. In the discussion, you've talked a fair bit about where ecocide began and what its next steps are going to look like. And I suppose my question is a bit more about what's your journey looked like linked in with that? How have you been involved? And going forward, how can we in this room, as students or as academics, be involved in helping this to progress?
Oh, that's so good. That is so good. I love that offer. No, I'm more about the support. Look, I'm full and frank disclosure. I'm new to ecocide, but I'm old to international criminal law. And my own journey, I have to say, only began last year when I was invited to the Economic Congress, Forest Economic Congress at Mona by Kirsha, and then met people and started talking about these sorts of issues, and the opportunity came up as the International Criminal Court Bar Association Ecocide Group. It's interesting because you only get a seat at that table if you've had, to be on the International Criminal Law Court list of counsel, you have to have at least 10 years experience in international criminal law, which not many people do. I think there's a handful of Australians that are on it. Most of them are in The Hague. So I'm grateful to have been able to be given a seat at the table, and I have, people instructing and providing advice. So my journey on ecocide is fresh and new. Which I think also is a good thing because I come with clean hands. Understanding the structures, and this is what's going to be really important, is that we have a lot of academics out there who can fill in that anthropocentric, ecocentric arguments and academia around it, and which is so important. Academia is incredibly important. But there's a really, really small group of people who understand from a practical sense how international criminal law works on the ground. People like me who've been on mission and collecting evidence, etc. Now, I think the way the science community is going to be able to help is, the traditional ways that we've collected evidence for war crimes, etc., is to go and interview witnesses. There is hard evidence collected, of course, as well, documentary evidence, etc. But that's the scientific projected evidence. This is all going to be really new, and I'm still learning about that as well. And we're going to lean heavily on the science community for that, as I've explained. But how you can get involved? Well, first and foremost, make noise about ecocide. I think that's really, really important. Write about it if you can. Get published about it if you can. That push for, unless the noises are made, it will. I don't want it to fall into the ether. I think there's enough people in the younger generation who are making noise, but we don't want them to be, stifled. So that's already a good start. Thanks.
What if I just
had
one observation?
Of course.
Just thinking about as Reggie gave that answer, I'm thinking about the relationship between science and the process of investigating international crimes. There's no way, for example, in contemplating charging the war crime of mass murder, that war crimes investigators can do the job of exhuming a mass grave without the forensic professionals. It's absolutely fundamental to the gathering of evidence about what actually happened, by what means were these individuals killed, and when did that happen? All the sort of technical, professional gathering of the forensic evidence that is fundamental to not just the laying of the charge, but the proof of the charge. And for me, when it comes to ecocide, the scientific expertise will be fundamental to any attempt to try and investigate and lay charges in relation to some future crime. So we need us lawyers, that is, you and me.
Yeah.
Absolutely need the science community, don't we?
Yeah.
can't do it on our own.
No, we can't.
Maybe you think we can, but we can't,
No.
actually.
No, I agree. I completely agree. And particularly in the former Yugoslavia, a lot of those graves were exhumed, even back then, you know.
That's right, yeah.
So,
Yes,
Tim,
question online? Maybe not. You go.
we've got some questions online. Did you want to read them out or do you want me to?
Perhaps to start with the first one.
Yeah, okay. So we've got a question from Katrina McLeod and she says, thanks Regina for a great talk, fascinating area. Would this legislation be applicable going forward or could there be retrospective application? And if so, would that just clog the system up? How would they manage the quantum of actions this could actually produce?
No, it wouldn't be retrospective. It would only be going forward. I know when there's been amendments in the past, for example, to the Rules of Procedure and Evidence, also to the Rome Statute, we had some in relation to, when I was there, in relation to evidentiary issues. There's been decisions which have said, no, it can't go backwards. So it would be going forward.
Okay, there's a related
Have
sort
you
of...
got something to say about that?
Just quickly, on retrospectivity, no national delegation in the Rome Diplomatic Conference was advocating for the Rome Statute to apply retrospectively. No one wanted that. Even the most, upstanding international citizens, all the naughty countries, none of them were advocating for that because all of them, I suspect, knew they've got skeletons in the closet, so to speak, in colloquial terms. So the Rome Statute only applies to conduct after entry into force of the statute. And similarly, with the amendment that Reggie talked about in 2010 of adding the crime of aggression to the court's jurisdiction in the Rome Statute, that didn't even apply to conduct post 2010. In fact, there was a 7-year sort of lead-in period when this particular amendment receives the necessary ratifications, but not before 7 years from now. So 2017, for conduct occurring from 2017 onwards before the court had jurisdiction over that new crime. So there was no way that it would apply retrospectively. I guess one issue for me would be whether the advance of the new crime being added to the Rome Statute, that might act as an incentive on states to take much more seriously what happens in their national jurisdictions. And many of them may choose to apply their law retrospectively or initiate criminalisation of the conduct before the Rome Statute provision comes into force and then have jurisdiction in their own, in their own national courts.
Yeah, it's also a matter of procedural fairness as well. You need to know what the crime is. And, once people are on notice that these are the elements of the crime, it might encourage, more compliance. But it also, the timeline you've just, it took 60 years to define aggression. I hope that doesn't happen with ecocide. And then, as Tim said, 7 years before anything, we've never had a charge, of course, but 7 years. There's a 7-year, waiting period. So if we apply that to ecocide, if it takes a few years to get it into the Rome Statute and then there's another waiting period, it's gives even more incentive to push for local and domestic legislation to criminalise ecocide locally in Australia.
A follow-up question, and you have answered the retrospective component of it, but Andrew Sullivan, who's a PhD student in the centre and with IMAS, has got a very interesting point, I think. He says, thank you, Regina. This is fascinating and intriguing. Modern Australia and the world's entire food production system is based on ecocide, at least with the proposed definition. So as per Katrina's question, if retrospective action could be taken, where would this leave us? You've addressed the retrospective bit, but it's a good point about food production systems.
It absolutely is. And, it would fall again, unlawful, wanton acts. And, I don't really have an answer for that, except it may encourage processes around food production to be rethought, to not, not impact the environment, widespread and damage to the environment. But yeah, I don't have an answer for that. So it's very tricky one. I don't know if you've got something there. It's good food for thought, that's for sure.
So there's quite a few questions coming through online. Shall I?
Yep, we've still got time.
We could give the room one more opportunity.
Yeah, Peter.
Just have one more there, and we'll come back on one.
I'm Peter George, resident of Tasmania. Recognising that obviously domestic law regarding ecocide would change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, I'm wondering what sort of pushback you might expect from international conglomerates, multinationals, say, working in the field, obviously, of fossil fuels and mining. Aren't they going to be? Would not those international companies feel threatened by the effects of what they're doing, the ramifications of what they're doing around the world, internationally?
Absolutely. And I think, in my view, that's why there's more of a push now towards war crimes. Let's leave it there, because you need the context of war crimes. And look at all the great work we're now going to do in that space environmentally. I'm not blind to the fact that the US have got a great influence over the International Criminal Court, and I can't imagine the US would ever be, pushing for this international jurisdiction over ecocide. And of course, if we settle on that definition of ecocide, which includes the wanton acts, you can't legislate your way out of acts which are then ecocide, which some countries may do, because the definition at the International Criminal Court needs to mirror, or your domestic legislation needs to mirror the International Criminal Court definition, which is exactly why I think there will be pushback. There will be countries influenced. I wish I could say that the Assembly of State Parties was an entirely democratic process where each state made up their own mind. It's not. It's a political animal where influence is used, funding, etc. Alliances are made. So, very valid point.
So you'd see these companies as being vulnerable to prosecution?
Well, they're the individuals that run them. Absolutely, yes, that's the whole point. Yes, thanks, Peter.
Okay, we've got a question from Ilaria Stolberg. Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. I was wondering, could negligence failure to enact protections on certain habitats be included in this definition? Do you think that this would encourage governments to act quicker or discourage them from taking more responsibility?
Oh, good question. I think so, yeah. Well, reckless acts or omissions. Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's the Rome Statute. I mean, certainly when I think about criminal responsibility, when I'm thinking in terms of the Rome Statute, when you have, say, command responsibility, you can have acts or omissions. Negligence as an omission, I don't see why that wouldn't be the case. Do you see it differently?
No, I don't see it differently, but I think that's an excellent question. And the way I would supplement Reggie's answer is just to offer an example. When it comes to the definition of war crimes in the Rome Statute, and I would also say that the court's active criminal investigation of alleged war crimes and other crimes in Afghanistan, that combination of realities provides an incentive to Australia, and now more recently the UK, to take much more seriously alleged war crimes by our respective elite special forces. Now, you could say on one level that if you looked at how the ICC approaches the priority crimes that it focuses on, looks at much larger scale crimes and higher level individuals responsible, and perhaps the ICC, it wouldn't even prioritise coalition behaviour like Australia's and the UK's in Afghanistan. But the mere prospect, the spectre, if you like, of the ICC stepping in if Australia failed to take seriously allegations over our elite special forces, and also now in the UK with the independent inquiry relating to Afghanistan, we don't want the ICC looking at possibly laying charges against our own special forces. We want to take primary national responsibility. Okay, that's a great thing from my perspective. The existence of the court and its jurisdiction over this same situation is an incentive on states to take much more seriously the rigorous investigation of alleged crimes and possibly the prosecution of them. So if you apply that sort of example to this scenario, the failure to act to protect natural habitat might be something that states say, well, look, if we don't do something about that ourselves, the court will, and we don't want our nationals being tried in The Hague. We'd rather deal with it here. And that would be a very positive thing.
Yeah.
Okay, there's still quite a few questions online, and actually I've got a sneaky one too, if I could later.
Just slip it in, Greta, anytime you want.
Michael Moringa, who's a research fellow in the centre, has got a question of, in your example of Uganda and Total Energies, how will this clause of ecocide help parties to balance their need for development as a country that warrants some degree of felling trees and potential for operating using precautionary principles to prevent environmental accident?
Yeah, I think this is one of those, look, the problem in Uganda, it's they are barging through. I saw that myself. We've seen that ourselves when we were in Uganda just last year. I think, and this is sort of probably a side topic, but interacting more with the Indigenous communities, with the local people on how, understanding that development needs to take place, but understanding how they can do it in a manner that doesn't barge through. And, you know, I know there's great big Chinese involvement in that pipeline. Track record for environmental respect of the environment is very low when it comes to that nation. And when you throw money at the issue, the Ugandan government has just taken it. Because, you know, you're driving on roads. 10 years ago, you didn't have the roads that we drove on last year. There's roads are paved, although they don't last very long because you've got rainy season and they all fall apart. But, you know, the short-term solution for global south countries and developing nations, they take them. So there is a responsibility, in my view, on the companies and the people who direct the decisions of those companies to engage more with the Indigenous communities and the people on the ground to understand the consequence. And I think this is what this definition really assists us with, because it makes us think about the consequence long term rather than the short term solution. And I think the decision makers, you know, who allow, you know, the Ugandan government should also be held responsible in this case. So it's combined responsibility. Yeah.
Speaking of combined responsibility, my question is, we know that there's roughly 100 companies in the world that are responsible collectively for around 70-something% of climate change or you know, atmosphere altering emissions that are leading to ecocide of the Great Barrier Reef, for example. Would this would you know, there be potential for including that kind
That's
of?
a horrific statistic.
Yeah.
Actually, we had someone speak to the group, an academic speak to the group last week, who said that there'd been huge steps being made, and you would know far more about this than I do, particularly at the University of Amsterdam, where emissions can actually be tracked to the damage that they do. That's how
Attribution.
Is that it? Yeah, attribution. Which I didn't read up on before I came today, but it was one of the things I actually was going to ask you guys about, how that works. So the potential is there. If science can lead the way in that regard, if you can find that an emission that happens here has caused long-term damage here, and this is the beauty of the International Criminal Court, because you have jurisdiction. So that's one of the important points which I didn't sort of focus on, but, you know, jurisdiction can go across borders, which it can't always when you've got domestic jurisdiction. So it's one of the issues, of course, that needs to be nutted out. But I would not negate that could happen. I mean, do you?
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Very good point. Attribution is so important for us.
Yeah, it is, particularly here. Yeah. Anyone in the room?
Dean.
Fantastic talk. Dean Greeno, Pakenham community member. I was thinking about your question about who would be the voice, and I think about the Māori, who are recognised whales, living beings of rivers and mountains, and that they could be then seen as also victims, which means you've got the victim repicide So I was just thinking about that as a process more. And does each of the 5 Velcro on each other, so to speak? So you got genocide of living being as well?
They're separate crimes, so they're separate crimes under the Rome Statute. But you can be charged concurrently, or for, you know, we charge all the time for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide for one individual. But it's a really good point. It's a point, you know. I'm not taking credit for any much of this knowledge. It was all from last week, where we had another academic speak to us about, you know, what is the victim? Who is the victim? And you make a really good point there. Because traditionally the victim has been the human, and that's who you give the money to at the end, you know, from the reparations. But that is certainly something, and I think that would have to come part and parcel with the amendments of the Rome Statute.
Cool. I could also see it tying into the fact that Wales are connected to Tasmania through oral histories, the Wiradjuri and all these other people. So I don't think the South Pacific Islanders and everything could all knit up on that one too.
Yeah. I have to say, I encouraged the representative of the Office of the Prosecutor who spoke to us to engage, and I told them about the Forest Economic Congress actually that I attended, and how the importance of the Aboriginal leaders and Aboriginal community being present there. I saw myself how important it was to bring the forestry, you know, the very, you know, very green side to the forestry and the Aboriginal community, and have them all together. And I told them about how powerful that was, and encouraged them to do the same thing on a global scale, get input from the Aboriginal or the Indigenous communities around the world. They are the people that have taken care of the land for longer. They've got far more experience than us. So it's, even though I was listening, I threw a lot of that out, and I think that will be part of our submissions as well when we comment on the policy. It's incredibly important.
Just one more question online.
Okay, so the last one here is from Phil McCormack. Fantastic presentation and discussion. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Just a reflection from me. If we are going to successfully implement the crime at a domestic level, it seems like we'll also need a really strong whistleblower protection law. So that those insiders who have the evidence that will make out the crime of ecocide can be protected if they come forward to provide that evidence, and that Australia has a terrible record on that point.
Couldn't agree with your niece more there, Tim. Absolutely, couldn't agree with you more. And also, you know, one of the big issues we had at the International Criminal Court is why one of the cases that I worked on, the Ruto case, where the now president of Kenya was charged with crimes against humanity, failed. Our witnesses were all interfered with. Some of them ended up dead in ditches, others were bribed, and the ones that we did manage to get turned up were declared hostile. So we failed at the no case to answer stage, to the halfway stage. And it's something that will remain important in these cases. Witness protection, whistleblower protection, you know, safe ways to blow that whistle, but fortunately there is a victim and witnesses unit which forms part of the International Criminal Court. I think there are some lessons learned out of the Kenya case. So there is a mechanism for dealing with those sorts of things. But absolutely valid point, Philippa.
Thanks, Reggie. Just ask Greta to come and propose a vote of thanks and wind up the proceedings. Thanks very much.
Okay, I'm not sure technically what a vote of thanks is, but I think I get the gist of it. So thank you very much, Tim and Regina, particularly after just coming back from such a long haul flight. We're delighted to have you both here today and talking about such an important topic for us as a global community going forward. So incredibly grateful for your time today. Jeff McGee as well for connecting everyone here and suggesting that this would be, you know, an incredibly important presentation to have today. And of course, everybody online and in the audience for coming along and contributing to such an interesting discussion. So please join me in thanking Tim and Regina. Thank you. Oh, one last comment. If anybody would like to be aware of any more kinds of seminars, activities, events along these lines, then go to the Centre for Marine Social Ecology website and just sign up for our
email list there. Thanks.
I will now. Thank you so much.